So okay, now what's important over here is uh, to see. Okay, and an important stuff to recognize over here is that the somites which have organized in this donut shape, that part of the somites which are present in the uh, near the medial end, okay, near the medial end, and the portion of the somites that is associated near the ventral end. All these somites, they again change their shape. Okay, I told you they became they first changed from spherical, they converted into epithelial like. Okay, they've undergone the epithelialization process. They went under the epithelialization process. Now what happens next is that the somites present on the medial aspect and somites present on this aspect over here, the ventral aspect, they'll now undergo the process of de-epithelialization. De-epithelialization is actually a simple process. It is just a reverse of epithelialization. And what really happens over here is that the somites, they lose their shape again. From the epithelial, they become mesenchymal and they start migrating again. Okay, initially uh, they went under the process of epithelialization and formed this structure. Now they'll lose their shape and they'll form mesenchymal cells, mesenchymal looking cells. Okay, mesenchyme is actually the uh, pluripotent connective tissue of the embryo. And once they form mesenchymal cells, what they'll do next is that this portion from here till here, this will kind of break off from the donut ring, and they'll form a new species of cells, which is actually one of the components of this these somites, and that component is known as the sclerotome. Okay, so we formed the very first component of the somites, or the very first derivative of the somites, the sclerotome is. Now after the sclerotome is made, okay, after these cells which have now lost their epithelial structure and they've become mesenchymal, and they've covered almost this entire region over here, uh, they form mesenchymal sclerotome cells. Okay, and these sclerotome will eventually give rise to the tendon, the axial skeleton, basically the tendon, the bone cartilage component of the embryo. Okay, we just talked about this portion. Then the cells which are left over here, the remaining cells of this donut shape, remaining cells, they'll they'll form two regions. Okay, on the two ends of these cells, one end that is closer to the neural tube. Okay, this end over here, which is closer to the neural tube, and at the same time it's closer to this end over here, to the dorsal end of the embryo. So it's closer to both the dorsal end and the medial end, right? This component of the somites differentiates into a special structure which is also one of the derivatives of the somites, called the myotome. And to be more specific, since it is present near the dorsal and the medial end, it's called the dorsomedial myotome. Dorsomedial component of the myotome. Similarly, on the other extreme end of the structure, which is closer to the ventral end, okay, relatively closer to the ventral end over here, and it is also onto closer to this lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, this region over here, this red region represents the lateral plate mesoderm. So this end over here is also gonna form myotome, but this time the myotome is not the dorsomedial myotome, but rather it's called the ventrolateral myotome. And you guys might have gotten an idea of why it's called the ventrolateral myotome, because it's nearer to the ventral aspect the aspect which is in on the front side of the embryo, and also nearer to the lateral aspect. This side is the lateral aspect and this side is the ventral aspect. So this end over here is closer to both the ventral and the lateral, so it's called the ventrolateral myotome, and this will give rise to the muscles of the embryo. Okay, most of the skeletal and most of the voluntary muscles of the embryo. Okay, voluntary muscles of the embryo, they are derived from the myotome. Okay, now so voluntary muscles are actually your skeletal muscles mainly. Then after this portion, this the portion of the somites which is left in between the two myotomes, this portion, let me mark it over here, this portion with the blue boundaries that I made, portion in between the ventrolateral myotome and the dorsomedial myotome is known as the dermatome. It's labeled over here. It's called the dermatome, and this is the third component uh, of these somites, and it will give rise to the dermis, the dermis of the back of the embryo, okay, of the back side of the embryo. Now once these differentiations or the differential products have been made of the somites, and by the way guys, an important fact to remember over here, that only somites can give rise to these three components. The somatomeres which are present in the head region of the embryo, they do not give rise to the components. Okay, somatomeres, they do not differentiate into these three components. It's only the somites that differentiate. Okay, once this is clear, we can move on. The myotomal cells on the ventrolateral aspect and on the dorsomedial aspect, they'll now start migrating. Okay, and once they start migrating, the the ventrolateral aspect, the myotomal cells present, okay, on the ventrolateral and dorsomedial aspect, they'll start migrating and they'll start coming beneath the dermatome. Okay, will start coming beneath the dermatome and eventually will form a whole layer of cells beneath this dermatome. Okay, as shown over here in this diagram, this grayish region over here represents the dermatome, and these cells over here represents the migrated myotomal cells. Okay, now this structure that is made, this component that contains both the dermatome and the myotome, is known as the dermamyotome. Dermomyotome. While this is happening, while this is happening, what other things happen to the embryo? Now, what happens next is that the cells from over here, from the ventrolateral aspect of the myotome or the ventrolateral myotome, the VLM, they start proliferating and they start migrating over here. Okay, what is this region over here? They start migrating into a layer of the lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, and from here they eventually go into the limb birds, and give rise to the muscles of the limbs. Muscles of the limbs. So now basically what has happened, the ventrolateral myotome, its cells, they started migrating into the parietal layer of the ventrolateral myotome. This entire region is the ventrolateral myotome, and I told you, remember in the previous lectures, that the ventrolateral myotome, it has a somatic layer and a visceral layer. The visceral layer, it gives rise to the involuntary muscles. Okay, the involuntary muscles, the cardiac muscles, and the smooth muscles, whereas the somatic layer or the somatic layer or the somatic mesoderm, it gives rise to the muscles of the body wall. And it also, okay, how does it give rise to the muscles of the body wall? It's not actually the the somatic mesoderm itself that gives rise to the muscles, but rather it's these migrated cells from the ventrolateral myotome that migrate uh, through this somatic mesoderm into the limb birds, and then they give rise to the muscles of the limbs. So it's actually the ventrolateral myotome that gives rise to the muscles of the limb, and it's not the somatic mesoderm that gives rise to the muscles of the limb. But what does the somatic mesoderm give rise to? This doesn't mean the somatic mesoderm does not have any role in muscle development of the limbs. Somatic mesoderm have a very special role in muscle developments of the limb. The somatic mesoderm, it gives rise to the mesenchymal cells or the mesenchymal tissue of the limbs. And once the mesenchymal tissues are made, the pattern in of muscle development, this pattern of muscle development, it's actually determined by this muscle tissue of the meso of this mesenchymal tissue of the limbs, which is derived from the parietal mesoderm or somatic mesoderm. The somatic mesoderm is also known as the parietal mesoderm. Okay, so that's an important part, an important concept, that both the myotome, the ventrolateral myotomal cells, along with the lateral plates, somatic mesoderm. The lateral plate has two divisions. The lateral plate mesoderm has two divisions, the visceral and the somatic. It's the somatic mesoderm that helps in forming the muscles of the limbs. They also give rise to uh, the most of the musculature of the body wall. Okay, the most of the musculature of the body wall, because soma means body, right? So it's mainly related to the body wall. So this was about the myotomal cell. This region